But what I'd really like to do now is to open it up to questions, comments, debate from all of you. So if I could see hands, please, so people who'd like to ask questions in the panel. Fantastic, lots of hands gone up. Lady in the orange, pink sort of cardigan over there. There's just a microphone coming round, actually, so if you don't mind using that, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah. This is kind of directed at Mark's talk, but can sort of be open. About choosing integration. At the individual level, how might we address the difficulties for people who might think, well, I want like you said, the best school for my kids, and it just happens that that's quite a segregated school, or the gentrification issue, where it's kind of it's damaging the community that was already there, but individuals moving in might feel that they've got a better deal. How do you address? How do we address the difficulties of individual experience?
Excellent question. More hands, please. Lady in the blue here. Just here.
I feel that some Muslim women alienate themselves by wearing the niqab. I'd like the panel's thoughts on that, because I personally find it very threatening.
And lady over there, the black and white.
Thank you. My question is about intersectionality and how we can bring that more into the debate. Particularly around, I was interested with the anecdote about the difference between the 50% plus Pakistani heritage girls' school and the 80% plus Pakistani heritage boys' school, as well as the question that Sonia brought up at the beginning about Muslim women teaching. Lived experiences in terms of gender have a huge effect on the way that people experience ethnicity as well as religion and lots of different factors. And while I agree that sometimes those things do trump, I'm interested in the panel's views on how those things as persevering lived experiences can come into play together and what that can mean in terms of policy and debate.
Great, thank you very much. Ted, so on this issue of balancing, encouraging people to choose integration with personal choice, what do you think we do about that?
I think for some people it's very difficult to choose to integrate because there are all sorts of structural inhibitions, particularly in terms of schools. In London, there is a slightly more diverse set of arrangements, but in a lot of towns and cities up and down the country, the school you go to will be determined by where you live, and that will be determined to a large extent by the nature of segregation or separation in those areas. And that's why schools have gone to some fairly desperate measures, where there is perhaps an all-white school and an all-minority school have had to develop school linking programs so that they twin the two schools, just because there is no way within each school that they can begin to build knowledge of each other. And there's a whole school linking network developed to try and give people the opportunity to come together. It's not satisfactory because the parents don't themselves develop friendships at the school gate because they're being bussed in or bussed across two different schools. There's only one school in the country in 22,000 schools in England that has attempted to bring two communities together in a shared school. And that's in Oldham. It's called the Waterhead Academy, and they closed an all-Asian minority school and an all-white school, and they created a mixed school. It took them 5 years, and the way they did it was to work with the communities and actually to convince both sides of the community that a shared school was better for education, it was better for the children's understanding, it was better for their own relationships, and they succeeded. And I think you have to intervene in a positive way to create those choices, because we're fooling ourselves if we think that people can just simply choose for themselves in every case. Yes, they can in certain instances, there are individual choices, but it's the same for things like sports clubs. In Bradford, they're totally segregated sports clubs, which have only been changed by intervention by local community organisations and sometimes by government organisations. It's the same in workplaces. I can take you to bagel factories, 5,000 employers, 5,000 employees, all of one ethnic group. And the chances of actually changing that position without some form of intervention, using the employers themselves, and in this case the food industry, to change their practices of recruitment, their practices of integration within the factory and so on, are just, it's just not going to happen. So I think, yes, let's try and encourage people, and where you've got to take the community with you, you've got to actually set the objective as a shared society as something which people can buy into, but you have to intervene to give people choices in many cases too.
And what about this lady who said that she finds a niqab threatening? What would you say? And can I just clarify, actually, because is a niqab a full face veil? Because, is it? Yeah. It is, okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't think we in Britain should intervene in what people choose to wear in that sense. I think, you know, the hijab, for example, which is obviously not a face veil, you know, something which, you know, we should actually foster as forms of identity. If people want to wear forms of identity, then, you know, that's part of their heritage. I think the whole question of the niqab and to some extent the burqa, if we try and ban it or try and intervene, then it will just make it more of a political expression, as has happened in France. And I think we just have to say, you know, these are things that we're prepared to live with. There are certain restrictions in any event on the wearing of full face veils in certain public services, in courts of law and so on, which are there. So, to me, going back to the previous question, we've got to encourage people to integrate and to share, and that by laying down a rigid dress code is never going to do that.
Omar, how do you think you encourage people to choose integration when they may not be doing so?
I think it goes back to the idea of post-integration, which I think is the idea of contribution. So the understanding that as a British citizen, I have a role and responsibility and duty to serve my community. And I think this is something which is an integral part of, I speak as a Muslim of the Islamic faith, the teachings of the Prophet teaches Muslims that those who are most beloved to God are those who are most beneficial to others. And I think that integral issue here, and I'm sure that crosses many other faiths, and not only the Islamic faith, but the idea of service, the idea of khidmah, as we say in Arabic. And I think this idea of duties for the communities as opposed to community is very, very important. Because again, there are instances where we can see some communities which are so segregated, but however, it's much more nuanced than us seeing it from the outset and assuming that communities are imposing the self-segregation because there isn't any other option. But it's an element, again, of fear which works both ways. And like integration is an element which works both ways, I think it's very important that we take into consideration the structural accommodations available, but also the different variables and sensitivities which surround individual choices. And I think it goes back to contribute. I mean, someone could argue that they are a millionaire, they pay taxes, and they are integrated in British society. But that's economic integration, if you will. There are other forms of integration when you talk about society. We have, we've had recently the Mosque Open Day, where we've had, many mosques up and down the country open their doors and have people of different faiths come and actually sit with them and speak about the niqab, speak about Ramadan, speak about the Quran, and is there extremism, and what is this? I mean, again, contact, talk. I think the idea of being threatened is very normal. It's very normal. And I think people shouldn't be judged because they feel threatened by someone else or something else. I think the ownership is on all of us here to make sure that there is this element of contact between the other, to understand, to appreciate, to put yourself in the other person's feet.
Thank you. Mark, I'm very interested in this gardening club that never happened, because that seems to be... I want to get away
from this gardening club.
I'm obsessed with it. But it does seem to be, to me, to be an example of where local government is trying to encourage integration. It's time between people of different classes, and people haven't taken it up. What do you think the answer is?
Tying that into the lady's question, because I think it does hit the nail on the head about all of this. There are clearly some things which you have to call it devolve. I wouldn't even call it devolve because it suggests that it's someone's ability to tell you what to wear in the first place. We've had a few states like that in the 20th century. They don't end well. I would never tell anyone what to wear, but we have to accept that individual decisions might add up to a society which is less integrated, less coherent than we might want. So I do think that school choice is absolutely at the nub, and I say that as someone, you know, who in 3 or 4 years' time will be taking that choice. I would be amazed if someone in my position were able to take that choice for me as a local government official, as opposed to me as the child's parent. So I'd be amazed at that. But I do think that at the moment we've got this hyper-plurality, particularly in education. We've got a system where you have extreme choice. And actually, we've maybe got to say, you know what, that choice is too extreme. And there are ways that you can bring that choice down. So the lady mentioned the two schools, the slightly more integrated girls' school and the slightly less integrated boys' school. The reason why the girls' school is slightly more integrated is because half a mile up the road, there's a Muslim girls' school. Now, I would say we shouldn't have faith schools full stop, but I would say that you take one of the potentially most segregated groups in British society, create a school for them. That school actually had 1 metre high fences around it when it was born as a school, so that nobody could see in or out. That is an appalling example of segregation. And that's the kind of the big thing where you can say that is wrong and we shouldn't do it. Smaller things, Ted's example is spot on. You know, the number of schools in Walthamstow that twin with places like Kenya, fantastic, no problem with it. But how many twin with a school in Keighley? None. They have no idea what goes on in those other parts of the country. And actually, I would take it a step further. British values, personally, I think there's interesting stuff in there. I think the phrase British values is difficult at best. But why not make Ofsted look at what schools are doing around integration as part of British values? Because I tell you what, you'll soon get head teachers thinking about it then, and you soon find plenty of schools in Walthamstow looking to twin with schools in Keighley. Probably far too many, actually. Can I just mention one final thing? Because I think tone matters in this stuff. I did mention David Cameron and the way that tone of the Conservative Party has changed over the last 10 years, for the better, I would say. But 2 examples over the last 2 or 3 months. You can laugh at Trump, but that tone matters. And that tone will have an enormously negative effect for decades, I would say, for people who voted for him and people who didn't. So I do think that matters. On the flip side, over here, you can laugh at it as a storm in a teacup and part of the London media when right-wing Conservative websites dig out Labour members who frankly shouldn't be a member of any political party, let alone the Labour Party, because of their anti-Semitic views. But it matters. And the fact that the party does nothing about it matters. It doesn't just matter about anti-Semitism. It matters because of the message you give out there about what our society looks like and where the boundaries are drawn around society and who's in and who's out. So I do think tone matters, not quite as much as policy, but as much.
Thank you. Sundar.
I thought the question about the niqab and dress is, you know, it's an important conversation. Thanks for asking it. It's a debate people want to have, and I think it jumps too quickly to close the conversation down. There's a risk of closing the conversation down too quickly for the answer to just be something that I happen to agree with, which is that I don't want to pass a law to ban it, because, you know, that's a very French approach, and we're not France. But that's saying we're not going to pass a law to ban it isn't the same as saying let's actually have a conversation about what that's about and how we feel about that, and actually the expressions of faith within a society. And there are people of faith, Christians and others, who feel the society is too secular and doesn't allow them to express their faith. And we should worry about that and make sure they feel they can express their faith. We should have a conversation about, you know, the deals we should make in a secular society of many faiths, and freedom of religion is a really good thing. It's why the Huguenots came, etc. And if people want their freedom of religion, good, as long as people can exit that religion and disbelieve as well as believe without being threatened. That's part of the deal, and so on. And so you can have these debates, and I think that, you know, wearing the hijab or wearing a cross and so on, that would be part of religious expression. That's the freedom of expression, as long as you're showing respect to other people. But then the niqab feels different to people, and it feels different to me.
But if I go to Iran
Yeah.
or Syria or
Yeah.
Malaysia,
Yeah.
And I'm absolutely fine to do that.
Yeah, because you're respecting the space that you're in. Yeah, and I
feel that, it's somehow so threatening.
And I mean, I agree with you that people feel discomfort. You know, threat is one thing, but the reason I think people feel discomforted about it, and you know, I agree with this myself really, is that it is an anti-integration symbol. It's saying to be safe in having my faith in your society. I need to insulate myself very carefully from all of you. It's a barrier to communication and so on. And so I would be more comfortable, not with just saying you can't wear it in the dock if you're charged, but if you're the front desk of a council or a university or something, that's not right. Now people can then wear it and choose to wear it, and that's not good for integration because people can choose not to integrate. But we can then have a conversation that a lot of people will have actually in minority communities to say, why is there more religious dress than there was, more conservative, traditionally conservative religious dress than there was 10 or 15 years ago? Because that's what everyone will say to you in East London and in Bradford. What is driving that? It might be a sense of persecution against that community that is being responded to in this way. So I think there's dangers of having it too narrowly, but actually, you know, we want to discourage the choice of it and avoid it. And then I think we need a bigger agenda as well, though, which is there are big generational shifts in our society. We need to bring about the generational shifts we need to see in minority communities, which are big as well. Massive distance between being a first-generation migrant who came here 50 years ago and your grandchildren, who might be third-generation British. And we need the share of voice in minority communities to be much stronger for younger women and younger men, but especially younger women in those communities, because older men in Asian communities have been playing the political system and getting away with it because we had an all-white political system. And if, you know, half of British Muslims are under 26 and half of them are girls, I want to hear what girls under 26 in Muslim communities want to do about those issues, which I think gets back to the intersectionality issue. And the media should put young women from minority communities on much more because it's the voice we never hear.
Right, thank you, Sundar. I'm glad we had a proper debate there. Lady at the back over there.
Hello, thank you for your talks. They're all really interesting. If we take integration in the traditional sense of racial and religious minorities coming into a kind of white Christian Britain, how would you convince these communities that now is the time for integration, now integration is the right thing to do, when historically the UK has been really hostile towards them and turning in on themselves is the only way to survive? So, yeah. The only way
Really
to
good
survive.
question. Thank you. Gentleman over there in the blue shirt. I'll come to you.
Two things. Mark, you had hit on the thing about a class being more important than perhaps race. What about the North-South divide? Do you see anything about the fact that the Chancellor is prepared to spend zillions on another railway across?
Oh, we're getting into budget territory here.
Across London, but you know what happens up north of Birmingham is irrelevant. That's the first thing, and the second thing is we're about to have a vote about the EU, and we're talking about sovereignty and the primacy of the rule of law. How do you actually define a rule of law when in fact the country can't decide who has the primacy of the rule of law?
Great, thank you. And lady in orange, just in front, actually, so you could just pass the... Oh, if you just don't mind waiting for the microphone.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Can you hear me now? Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
What does the team think about the ability to be able to understand and speak English as an integrating factor?
Great.
It seems to me there are lots of islets of people that haven't yet been able to do that, which must be difficult.
Thank you. Don't worry. All right, seeing as you're next door, you can get another question in.
And should the government compel people...
Sorry, just say that again?
And should the government compel people to learn English? Just
Great
to
question.
add to the lady's point.
Excellent, thank you. Really good set of questions there, and I like the fact that you called us a team. And I thought the question as well about kind of encouraging minority communities to integrate is an excellent one, but it also raises a question for me about what are we asking about people from white communities? Because actually I think it was the Social Integration Commission that found that people from white communities are just as not integrated as people from minority communities. So maybe I would add that to your question. Mark, do you want to kick us off this time?
Okay, let's start with the North-South divide as someone born and bred in Walthamstow, at election time anyway. I would say actually it's a bigger question than North-South, and it does come down to class. And I would, if you haven't read it, it's well worth reading. So in about this time last year, just before the election, the London Review of Books sent a journalist to Grimsby to cover what it thought would be a UKIP gain from Labour, and didn't quite happen that way. The tone is not condescending, because that would probably be unfair to the journalist. But what is very clear, that you may as well have sent this journalist to Tash Kent. You know, this journalist, Grimsby was not part of their social milieu. It was not part of the social milieu of most people who read it. My family happens to be from Hull, so I wouldn't be seen dead in Grimsby, but for different reasons. What was really clear was that the mixing of different parts of the country was, you know, I can't put words into this journalist's mouth, but very clearly the milieu that a lot of people who read that article existed in had more in common with their Twitter friends in New York than with their fellow countrymen and women in Grimsby. That is definitely true. And it's well worth reading that article, so I think it actually uncovers a lot of these things, to be fair to the journalist. So I do think there's an issue there. Speaking and compelling around English, I mean, it's a fact that the people who are least likely to speak English, in my ward at least, are Eastern European women and Pakistani heritage women. The difference between them is the Pakistani heritage women tend to be British and the Eastern Europeans aren't, because they haven't paid their £1,000 to get a passport. Why would you? Those are two groups who are unable to play a role, at least in the legitimate economy. They are unable to play a role at the school gate. They are incredibly, incredibly marginalised. Would their lives be better if they spoke English? I think unquestionably yes. Interestingly, the men tend to speak English because they're going out to work, and they are quite often, contrary to a lot of things, I think they are speaking English with people at work. So I do think you have that quite a gendered divide and a class divide as well, but probably more gender.
So should we force people?
Would you compel people? I have to say, I think it's worth asking the question as part of who comes into the country. But for me, the immigration integration debate really falls down into who comes in, of which we talk a lot about, and what happens when people are here, of which we talk very little. And actually, once people are here, can you create dual classes of citizenship? No, I don't think you can. But can you make it a requirement before someone comes here, outside of asylum and things like that, to at least make an effort to learn English? I think that's something that is worth looking at. I would personally say yes, but I think it's too controversial to leave it on the whim of one person, clearly not me. And then the final thing I would say, just coming back to Sunder's point, only because Sonia wouldn't let me say it last time. I would just say that the point about the niqab, I think it is an interesting one, but you have to say that if a society as a whole is so perturbed by what another person wears, then its sense of itself is incredibly fragile, I would say. Now, that may be true of us, but I would say that, do we want our sense of ourselves to be that fragile? No, we don't. And so that probably pushes us into certain directions, particularly around what people wear.
Thanks, Mark. Omar, would you compel people to learn English?
No, is a short answer. However, I do see the benefits of learning English, definitely for, you know, integrating within society, again, contributing within society. It's a no-brainer. I mean, put it this way, if you were to go to a country where you were relocating and you didn't know the language, would you not want to learn that language?
Yeah.
That's the
Show of hands?
Show of hands who would want to learn that language if you're relocating.
Yeah, everyone.
It's common sense. Yeah. Why would you not want to learn that? No, so that's maybe...
Yeah, can I come back to you when we've been to panel? Thanks. I will do though.
Sorry, so with respect to whether a single community is then marginalized, that's something else. That's political predilections, what I call. That's when politicians seek to create and, engage in this us and them discourse. I think there have been many, many instances where the government, David Cameron, has had marvelous opportunities to engage in the communities, and unfortunately it's backfired. The PREVENT program is one. This comments about the English language for particularly Muslim women.
Omar, what do you think? What do you think is the problem about the PREVENT program?
Well, where do we begin? I mean, the fact that you are singling out the Muslim community is what is my issue with it. And I mean, to suggest that someone who is 3 years of age, a boy of 3 years old, with a Palestine badge, is then put onto a channel program for radicalization.
Has that happened?
That has happened, yes. And more other stories have happened as well. And I think, again, we've seen a debate with PREVENT go beyond that and actually try to sort of, with its tentacles around university campuses and how whether we should clamp down on certain speakers. And again, this idea of freedom of speech opens a different can of worms. And I think if we are to say that we do live in a pluralistic society, then we should be consistent in our liberal values and not just accept some values for some people and then single out other communities with other values. That's my perspective. But I do agree. I do think singling out a specific community is wrong. However, I do encourage all communities, irrespective of where they live, to learn the language. Because it just means, again, your service. Where does your service come in? Where is your added value? Where is your contribution? I think that's very, very important. And Foucault mentions this in his works, the language of power. I think, the very fact that this talk is called Integrated Britain, but every single one of us mentioned Muslim in their presentation says a lot. We haven't talked about the Jewish community, we haven't talked about the Christian community, and we haven't talked about the atheist community, we've talked about Muslims. So even that is quite subtle in how we are actually portraying the current climate.
Ted?
I was just thinking about all the British people that go to live in Spain. Do they learn Spanish? Don't think so. But actually, the Spanish example is very interesting because if you go to Spain, you don't get really any help with the Spanish language. If you go to Catalonia, and of course the Catalans make a big point of saying they're not Spanish, then you will get help with the Catalan language. And I feel that we should be doing the same in Britain. It shouldn't be compulsory because rather like the niqab, I think that's going to be counterproductive. But what we should be doing is helping people to learn English. And of course, we've seen a huge number of cuts in ESOL work. We've seen really no attempt, I think, to have a pervasive English language program. In Catalonia, they provide buddies from the community, somebody who speaks Catalan, to come and talk to you on a regular basis and encourage you to join in, to be part of Catalonia, to learn Catalan. It's done with some voluntary help. And so I think that's the way that we should go. And it's absolutely essential that people coming to live in this country as citizens learn English, because they can't take part in democratic debate, they can't take part in economic activity to the same extent, and they will, unfortunately, not be able to get the same level of job and occupation and salary unless they become fluent in English over a short period of time. So I think English language is vital. We can't have bridging cultures. We can't have people in contact with each other unless they can share a common language. So I do think that's important. The other question that came up was about how do we get people to think about minorities integrating into Britain in different ways. And the problem that we've had with integration, and to some extent with cohesion, is that we've seen the problem based on minority communities. Actually, minority communities are generally much more able to integrate and adapt to other cultures because they're moving, because they are actually part of that process of integration. The most resistance we get to integration is from existing communities, mainly from white communities who see that as a change to their own form of identity. And what we've not really done is focused our integration program on majority communities. And I think there's a big selling point to be made there about how do we get majority communities to think of integration as a positive thing. And actually, if you talk to majority communities about that, as I've done in places like Stoke or Dewsbury or Bristol, they do actually understand, just as anybody else does, that the world is changing, that their children will need global skills, that they will need actually to be able to work in a global competitive environment, that it will be good if their school actually engages in that sort of program. Most people understand you can't disinvent EasyJet. People now travel all over the world. People are moving constantly in completely different ways. So unless we can actually convince people that it's necessary to be part of this global environment, it's necessary to have global skills, then we're never going to move on. I was really interested in PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, are taking young graduates in Britain and realizing that they'll never be able to work in a global environment because they haven't got the global skills. So they're doing a contemporary global education program with those youngsters so that they can actually cope in a more international environment. If you compare our youngsters with kids in China or India or many other countries, they're already at that level. They've got those global skills. So we have to, I think, do a very good job in convincing people that global skills are important for competition, they're important for your future working environment.
Thank you. Now, I'm aware I haven't come to you, Sundar, but we've got 8 minutes left. So what I'm going to do, if it's all right with you, is ask for a couple more contributions on the floor. I'm going to give Sundar a proper chance to respond. Then I'm going to ask the other 3 panellists for a 30-second concluding reflection. And you can do a 30-second concluding reflection as well. So the lady who wanted to come in before, do you still want to? Do you mind just waiting for the microphone? Great, thank you.
Thank you. It's just a quick question around the notion of compulsory or non-compulsory, the need to speak English, and particularly the focus on women and Muslim women. And I suppose the question that I have, and I don't know the answer to this, is what are the causes preventing that happening? And I think that's a key question for me, because I wonder, that we have this focus on, do we force them? But what are the real reasons that are stopping them? And to what extent do those reasons exist in the wider society, or are there other micro issues going on?
It's an excellent question, thank you. A couple more. Lady over there with a scarf on.
Hi, I wanted to draw on the example that Omar made about the individual that was at the Ramadan tent, and I wanted to ask Omar what he took away from that personal example and what you thought were the conditions that enabled that person to feel, to engage and feel a sense of belonging from that. And then also, Sundar talked about the importance of stories and communicating stories to build integration. And I wondered who you think is best placed to lead on those stories so that others can hear from them and we can start to get a sense of shared identity through them.
Good question. And there was one more over there. Thank you.
Hi. How do you get people to integrate on an individual level when people are quite naturally drawn to people who are similar to themselves, particularly on a social level? So I live in quite a multicultural area in terms of class and ethnicity and whatever, but I'll still socialise with a certain number of people, and I wouldn't feel comfortable if someone has such different values to me to socialise with them.
Great question. Sundar, coming to you for a proper response on those.
Thanks. There's some really good questions there. Nobody picked up the question about society potentially being hostile to ethnic minorities and how is that a barrier. And I think that was really true, and I think we've not understood that enough, that racism at the levels it was at in the late 1960s was a real barrier to integration, and we should understand actually prejudice as a barrier to integration, as another reason to come together and tackle forms of prejudice. But I also disagree, these things are very subjective, I disagree with the premise of the question, because my experience of Britain hasn't been of it as a society that is hostile to people from minority backgrounds. And all this questions are being asked about how do we get people to do this if they don't want to do it. Just to remember the glass is half full as well. A thing that Britain has achieved that has not been achieved in other European countries or in the United States is that the ethnic attainment gap in schools has now closed. You know, it's just different for different groups. The white British are somewhere in the middle, and ethnic minority Britons are more likely to be graduates than their fellow citizens. So that's closed, and if that doesn't then close the gaps in the job market and in the institutions of power and the newsrooms and the judiciary and so on, then something's gone wrong, where people who took on board the idea they got a fair shot and went for it, didn't then get a fair chance. The fastest growing catch-up is among girls from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, so there's a real sense that you could empower that generation, and that's really important. The English language thing is just really important, and tone matters, because David Cameron's managed to have a massive row about spending £20 million on more English lessons because of the way he said it. It's so important to be part of our democracy, part of our economy at the school gate. The question of what was going on with the first generation of Asian women, it was a very isolated group. It was about the attitudes in the household and in the community. We haven't repeated that mistake, and research has been done with that generation of Asian women. They feel a sense of regret about that. They still feel a sense of attachment to, their locality. They feel pride in their daughters and granddaughters having horizons that they didn't have. So I think if we can make this less punitive and more about the upside, we did some research in Southampton with British-born people in polls, and the people I've never heard being so strong on the need to speak English if you come here were the Polish migrants, who were really unhappy with Poles who thought they wouldn't do that, let the side down. They couldn't have been clearer about that, and we should realise, actually, we can agree on this.
Great. Thank you, Cinder. 30 seconds, Mark.
Okay, so 5 things. 1, make it...
5 things?
5 things.
Oh, okay. You're going to do them briefly.
That doesn't count for my 30 seconds. So 1, make it happen. There's a reason why it doesn't happen at the moment, because we haven't chose to make it happen. You go to the FA, you go to the English Cricket Board, they've got a diversity policy, no integration policy. Don't be surprised when you get all mono-ethnic football and cricket teams. 2, make it easy. School choice at the moment, the easy choice is the segregated choice. You have to make it easy to integrate. 3, make it worthwhile. The point around twinning with Keighley as well as Kenya, if you make it worthwhile through Ofsted, schools will do it. 4, make it about everyone. The reason why Cameron's point about Muslim women learning English wasn't wrong in itself, it was wrong that he singled out Muslim women. It's about everyone learning English. And number 5, make it fun.
Great, thank you. Omar. Okay, we get a little clap there.
I think it goes back to the idea of ownership, the question about the volunteer who joined the project in the first instance. And I think a lot of youth these days feel neglected. They feel their voices are not being heard. They feel they're being marginalized. They feel that they're not being actually consulted. The idea of ownership is very, very important, not only for the youth, but for citizens as well. So I think this idea that we need to refocus our way of life, our philosophy of life on citizenship. What does citizenship actually mean? Our duties, our responsibility, and also the importance of what you want for yourself, you want for the other person as well. I think quite often we live in a very much detached world, an individualistic world. And I think it goes back to the idea of being defined by your ethical presence as opposed to your allegiance, so to speak. And I think wherever you are in this globe, wherever you are, Apadurwai has talked about these scopes, and the idea that the world goes beyond borders and nation states, the idea that you are defined not by where you are, but your ethical presence wherever you may go, whether it's in London, whether it's in Manchester, whether it's in Hawaii, etc., etc. And I think encouraging there's as many voices as possible to be on the discussion and not to single out communities is very, very important.
2 things really. I think firstly, just to entirely support Mark, that I think this is about personal choice. But you have to facilitate that choice. You have to make sure that people are willing to get out their comfort zones, to talk to other people and actually find out whether they do have the same values. You have to make it fun, exciting, accessible. You do have to make it for everyone. So I think that is about some form of facilitated program. We can't just leave it to people's whims. It has to be, in some ways, engineered and facilitated. Secondly, though, we do have to redefine identity. We do have to think about a new way of talking about ourselves. I was very struck by Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra, who was being pressed on the television to give a particular view, and they kept saying to him, "Tell us what you think as a Muslim." And he said, "Well, I am a Muslim, but I'm a person first." And the problem at the moment is that we are continually trying to put labels onto people, put people into boxes, rather than recognise the commonalities and the common humanity that we have.
Great, thank you very much. So, 10 seconds, go on then.
Tonight we've sometimes made it sound a bit difficult. It's not that people don't want to do it. If you have schools that do segregate people, it's really hard. The only bit that's difficult is that once you feel that there is difference and people aren't integrating, it's got a bit segregated. We're all British. It's quite hard to make the first move. If you do things together, people do want to do that. And so actually bridging the contact gap so we do things together, and you'll get integration and your kids will make the friends that they make.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks, Cinder. So that, wait, before we clap, I will definitely give you a chance to clap. But before we do that, just wanted to say a huge thank you to our panel, very distinguished panel. I think we had a really great debate today. Thank you to the Royal Geographical Society for hosting us. Most of all, thanks to all of you for coming along and having such a fantastic debate. And I've been told to tell you about two things. One is you've got feedback forms on the back of your tickets, and it'd be really great if you could fill those in. The second of which is there's a bar, which will be open after this. It has been suggested to me that you might want to fill in your feedback form while having a drink in the bar, but I leave that up to you. But thank you very much all for coming along and participating.